This one, plagiarism.
So basically what copyright is and how plagiarism is different from copyright violation. What are the different types of plagiarism? Is plagiarism the same as similarity? What could be the consequences if plagiarism is detected? As students, how we will avoid falling foul of plagiarism before we continue? So, what is copyright? Copyright is the preservation of intellectual property rights in matters related to authorship. So, this is with respect to copyright. So, it's important for the prospective authors to understand that one of the principles of copyright preservation are these. First, to safeguard the whole work from copyright violation. Second, overall to safeguard against inadvertent violation of the same, because it has moral, ethical, and legal consequences. Moral in the sense, obviously, it's not right to steal somebody else's work. Ethical, it is again wrong that you are stealing somebody else's work, and copyright violation has legal consequences also. You may be asked to pay a fine or face consequences based on the law. Before we go further, one must understand that broadly there are two scientific models. One is a subscription-based model wherein you subscribe to journals or you pay for view of the article, and those who do not subscribe cannot access the article. The second is open access, which is now coming out in a big way, which means that these articles are available for use by anybody and everybody. They don't have to pay for it. Now, somebody has to pay for this. So, in Platinum Open Access, the authors are not charged. Generally, society journals may publish their articles as Platinum Open Access, so they bear the cost of the publication. Gold Open Access is when the authors pay for it. When you publish an article as Gold Open Access, you pay for the article processing charges, as a consequence of which it is made open access. Or green open access is that it's published in subscription-based model, but the accepted version, not the final PDF. The accepted version can be freely distributed after a certain embargo period, say for 6 months or 1 year later. You can post the accepted version of the manuscript anywhere you like and share it with anyone you like. So, with whom does copyright rest? That is the next question. So, avoid violating copyright laws, understand with whom copyright rests. It could rest with the authors if the article is published as open access. It could rest with the journal of the publisher if the article is published in subscription mode. Some open access journals may actually retain the copyright, but ideally, open access means that the copyright should rest with the authors. So, how do we identify with whom the copyright lies? So, these are two articles, one published as open access and the other published as subscription access. So, if you look for the symbol C, you will find that the copyright here rests with the authors, whereas the copyright here rests with the publisher. So, look for the symbol C to identify with whom the copyright lies. And why it's important to identify this? So that one can seek appropriate permission for reproduction. If you are reproducing copyrighted material, if it is text, say sentences, passages, or paragraphs, then always do so within double quotes. If it is not your own language, always reproduce it within double quotes, and also attribute the source, that is, give a reference to the source from which you are reproducing it. And obviously, if you are reproducing figures and tables, there you can't put double quotes, but you really say that reproduced with permission from this source. What is important is to seek written permission of a copyright holder. Even if the copyright holder is yours, even if it's your own article, let's say you have published something as open access and you are reproducing something from that, get a letter written to yourself that so and so we are giving permission for reproduction. Because the other publisher is never going to publish it unless it happens. Second, even if it's your own article, it is published as a subscription model. and you want to reproduce, say, a figure or a table, then you have to seek permission of the publisher. And this is very important. You may think that I have produced this material, why do I need to seek permission? Because you hand over copyright to the publisher. Once the article is accepted, if it's a subscription model publication, then you hand over the copyright to the publisher. So even to reproduce such content or to adapt such content, you need to seek permission for reproduction. For example, this was a table that we had synthesized and published in a journal that is published by Elsevier. We wanted to synthesize a similar table, which is, as you can see, it's quite different, but some concepts were similar. To reproduce this table in another publication, which is published by another publisher, we had to seek permission for reproduction. Even if it was a table that we had initially synthesized ourselves. So how to seek permission for reproduction? If it is open access and the journal insists the next journal that you submit to seek permission, then get a letter from the author. Or if the journal does not insist this, then you can reproduce with a clear attribution to the source. That is essential. That goes without saying. You must say from where you have taken this. If the author holds copyright, then write them an email asking them for permission. Or if the journal publisher holds copyright, then you need to seek their permission. You should see how. So, for example, this is another article wherein if you go down to the bottom of the page, then you see that there is this reprints and permissions, rights and permissions. You click that, it takes you to something called as rights link. This is a website which many publishers use to provide permission for reproduction. And here they will ask you to give various details, what portion of the article you want to reproduce, how many tables, how many figures, what proportion of the article, whether you are publishing it yourself or in a journal, how many copies, etc., etc. And then they give you the permission. So you have to make this selection. After this, a huge page comes with another 10 to 15 parameters, which you have to put in, and then you get a permission to reproduce. Sometimes it may cost money, but generally for academic purposes, for reproduction of minimum amount of material, say a table or a figure, generally they will not charge anything. But if it's for a commercial purpose, say you're publishing a book and you want to reproduce, you are going to get royalty from that book, then you might yet be asked to pay. Now, what happens if there is violation of copyright? Let's say this is the original manuscript. Plagiarism is a part of it are reproduced without duly attributing that this is the source of it and without double. There could be duplicate publication. Something that was published, say, in a Russian language journal, now is published again in another journal of English language without saying that it was initially published in the Russian language. A point to note here is that there are certain journals that are published in two languages. In that case, the journal itself publishes a version in English and say in Brazilian or some other language. That's acceptable, but the author doing this is not acceptable. Redundant publications could be that you slightly change the content, slightly inflate the content. Maybe they had 110 patients, you include 130 patients. Or you maybe they looked at 7 different parameters, you look at 5 different parameters. Essentially, they don't add much to the existing literature. So this is what is called as redundant publication. And salami slicing is this thing could easily have been published as one single manuscript, but you slice it into 7 different manuscripts to increase the number of publications. Again, that is unethical and should be avoided. There are certain instances we shall see when duplicate publication is warranted. There are certain instances when multiple publications may come out from a single data set without it being salami slicing. We shall see these. So as we saw that plagiarism is when you reproduce something verbatim without saying that this is a verbatim reproduction and without duly attributing the source. The duplicate publication. So as we saw, some collaborative publications, for example, criteria. This is in our specialty, the rheumatoid arthritis criteria was published simultaneously in 2 major journals. This from the American College of Rheumatology and this from the ULAR. Exactly the same content, same author. So this is acceptable because when these papers were submitted to the journals, it was made clear to the editors of both the journals that we intend to publish it simultaneously in this journal as well as that, because the criteria were developed jointly by these two different societies, and these are the two different society journals. So that is not a problem as long as you have declared transparently at the time of submission that you are publishing it elsewhere also. This kind of thing may apply to diagnostic or classification criteria or to treatment recommendations. So if the authors have received approval from editors of both journals and the priority of the primary publication is respected by a publication interval negotiated by both authors and editors, in this case, both were published simultaneously on the same day because they were collaborative effort of two major societies. The paper for secondary publication may be intended for a different group of readers. Could be maybe an abbreviated version with due permission of the publisher and the editor. That is very much feasible. And the secondary version should reflect the data and interpretations of the primary paper. For example, you may want to reproduce something that you have published in English in a local language. As long as you do that with due permission and with a justification, that's fine. But doing it as such without declaring that you are doing so, that is wrong. The secondary version could inform readers, peers, and documenting agencies that the paper has been published in whole or in part elsewhere. So, for example, you may have a note that reads, this article is based on a study first reported in so and so journal. Or the title of the secondary publication should indicate that it's a secondary publication, a complete or abridged republication or translation, in which case it may be acceptable. But generally, this is an exception. Now, redundant publications we have seen, and salami slicing. This is an extreme example of salami slicing. All these are publications available on PubMed, and all of these have the exact same title except for the province in Iran. There are 33 provinces in Iran, and each one deals with one single province, the same list of authors, the same parameters, one paper for each province. This is salami slicing. This is not acceptable. They could very well have published all the data in one single paper, presenting it that this was seen in 33 different provinces, and these were the data. So this is another similar paper wherein there is a lot of overlap in the content, and the results are essentially very similar based on similar methods in two related populations. Again, there is significant overlap, and these are salami publications. Where is splitting a study into different papers acceptable? When they look at different aspects, mostly unrelated to each other. For example, you could have a study of patients with rheumatoid arthritis recruited from the same population, but for different studies. In one in which you see clinical risk factors, in another you look at biomarkers, and third you do a gene expression analysis of the peripheral neuron. Obviously, you can't combine all of this. It doesn't make any sense. There you have three different papers based on the same data set. That's perfectly fine. You look at clinical risk factors for poor disease outcomes, which is in itself an extensive paper, and another paper looks at clinical risk factors for mortality. That's also acceptable, provided you acknowledge that these are based on the same data. You may look at one biomarker and another distinct biomarker. That also is acceptable. But simply looking at 20 different biomarkers and making 20 different papers out of the same, that may not be. If clubbing these studies together makes little sense for the reader or for the journal, then it is acceptable to split the study into different multiple publications. So we have seen this. What are the differences between plagiarism and copyright? Plagiarism is an ethical construct, whereas copyright is a legal construct. The interpretation of plagiarism is more abstract. I, as an editor, may say it is plagiarized, somebody else may say it is not plagiarized. Whereas copyright is based on what is the local regulation. Plagiarism is an offense against the author, whereas copyright is an offense against the copyright owner. Copying ideas can also be considered as plagiarism, but it will not be copyright infringement unless the idea has already been published, say in a sequence of words, image, or a written plan. and how to avoid plagiarism when you are needing to repeat someone else's work by giving new credit, by quoting and citing the reference. Whereas copyright requires permission from the copyright holder, and as we saw, in the instance of reproduction of material from a published journal, you may require to pay some financial compensation as well. Copyright has fixed time duration based on local law, whereas plagiarism, there is no time limit. Even if I were to plagiarize something written by Shakespeare, that would still count to be plagiarism. So nowadays, people are using a lot of social media for educational purposes. So when you post copyrighted content on social media, the same rules apply. As for reproducing any other material, that is duly attributed to the source and say that it was taken from so and so, and this is the link to the original source. As long as you do that, it generally is not an issue. So now more detail about plagiarism. So what is plagiarism? Plagiarism is an act of misappropriation of somebody else's intellectual property, including but not limited to scholarly texts, research methods, graphics, and ideas. Failure to obtain permission to reproduce previously published material and acknowledge primary sources are the main components of the misappropriation. So two things. You are not obtaining permission to reproduce and you are not acknowledging the primary source. So as we saw that this is plagiarism. Of these 7 different things that constituted a manuscript, 3 have been reproduced verbatim without any reference to the original source. So what could be the various types of plagiarism? Let's say the original statement is that the mouse ran a bit long. It is acceptable to say that, as mentioned in the popular nursery rhyme, the mouse climbed up the long. This is not plagiarism. You may simply directly plagiarize it without reference. You could make it into an image and express the same thing in the form of an image without duly referencing the source. That could be image plagiarism. Find replace plagiarism is you use the technical term for mouse, and instead of clock you write chronometer. That also is plagiarism. Mosaic plagiarism is you add another sentence to it. You plagiarize another sentence from somewhere else, add it to it. So you're mixing 2 sources in the hope that it will not be caught. Similarly, for patchwork plagiarism, and a 404 error is, what is a 404 error? Yes, internet savvy generation has yeah, not who said that? Sai, you said. Who said not found? Okay. So when you go to a web page and you get a 404 error, it's not found. So here you see they have mentioned that, as mentioned in this novel, the mouse ran. It was not mentioned in this novel. Then another way of classifying the types of plagiarism is plagiarism of ideas. That is, I have an idea with relation to manuscript. I discussed it with one of my collaborators in a meeting, and I'm working on that manuscript and I see that published. So that is plagiarism of ideas. Direct verbatim copying, obviously, and generally it affects inexperienced authors who are many times unaware of plagiarism, copy text without reference. Paraphraserism, that is, you copy some passages, change a few words here and there in an attempt to confuse the similarity checking software. Here they have written anti-plagiarism software, that is a wrong terminology which we will see later. Text recycling, you are using the same text that you have used in another paper without duly referencing the source, thinking that it was after all my own creation. Translational plagiarism, as we saw, something was published in Russian and now published in English. Plagiarism of graphics, this is something that is really difficult to understand. We shall see some techniques as to how it may be possible to identify plagiarism of graphics. Plagiarism with citation manipulation. You cite either non-existent sources or manipulate the citations to conceal substantiated plagiarism. Compound plagiarism is when you combine all of these different things. So now, why did I say that the term anti-plagiarism software is a wrong term? Similarity is the degree of similarity between a given piece of text in the previously published paper. So these softwares like Authenticate or Turnitin help you to identify similarity. They cannot tell you whether something is plagiarized or not. So the good software like Authenticator or Prasanna are costly. You cannot subscribe to them individually. And only if your institution has a subscription, then you can use this software. But there are free softwares as well. And we shall see that there are some techniques that you can use to avoid falling foul of plagiarism, even if you don't have access to any software. So how do we say something is a good software, something is not a very good software with respect to similarity? It depends on the database the software has access to compare against while assessing the similarity of a particular piece of text. So why Authenticator Plagiarism is powerful? Because they have access to a massive database. Every day these software crawl through millions of web pages and archive them. So even if those web pages are no more available 6 months down the line, and you have copied it from there, they will be able to identify that as well. Content which is no more available on the internet is still available on these softwares. And let's say you have fallen foul to a predatory journal. You did not know it was a predatory journal. You submitted an application there. Suddenly, after that, they ask you for money, and you realize that it's a predatory journal now. I don't want to pay money. They'll ask you for a fee for withdrawal. So you pay that fee, which is 1/3 of the publication fee that they have asked, and your application is withdrawn and no more available on the internet. But these softwares have already gone through the pages of the internet during the 5 days that the article was available. So even if you withdraw it, it will be still flagged as plagiarism, and therefore you will not be able to republish it elsewhere. So never submit to a predatory journal, because not only will you never be able to publish it again, even if you withdraw it, nobody will read it, nobody will cite it. It's not a waste of paper because it's not published on paper, but it's a waste of PDF and online space. That's what it is if you publish in a predatory journal. So these are the different softwares that are available. Authenticate, Grammarly has paid the similarity checking software, but Grammarly otherwise is very useful software for its free grammar check function. The basic grammar check function of Grammarly is free, and you can use it to improve your manuscript before you are submitting them for publication. Because all said and done, the grammar and the usage of English that we have has some flaws inherently because we are not native English speakers. So using such free softwares for checking the grammar is a good idea before you submit to a journal. Then there are other various free and paid softwares, each with different power to detect similarities. So if it's a less powerful software, your article may actually be similar, but you still cannot identify it. So plagiarism is the duplication of content without due attribution, whereas similarity is simply how similar the text is as compared to what was previously published. Ease of identification similarity is based on the output of the similarity checking software, but based on the output, the editor has to take a decision whether this amounts to plagiarism or not. For example, you may have written a 5,000 word manuscript, entirely original except for the 2 figures you have copied from the internet without really attributing the source. So your similarity is 0. Whereas you may have written a manuscript wherein you have introduced the method section because there are limited number of ways in which you can describe the methodology. You have introduced the method section from a previously published manuscript with due attribution to the source in double quotes, and that amounts to 20% of the paper. There, your similarity flags up as 20%, but since you have duly attributed the source, put it in double quotes, it is not plagiarism. So the decision regarding plagiarism has to be made by a human. The software cannot help you to identify whether it is plagiarism or not. The gold standard for similarity is based on the breadth of coverage of the similarity checking software. Whereas for plagiarism is the source from which plagiarism is occurred. The judgment for plagiarism is subjective, whereas similarity obviously is an objective assessment. The threshold for action based on similarity is arbitrary based on cutoffs which journals decide, whereas for plagiarism has to be decided by the editor and possibly by the reviewer if they have access to the software, or they are able to per se identify certain plagiarism like plagiarism of graphics or images or pages. So if similarity is identified, then it may be revised during revision, or if the similarity is too high as per the Jones threshold, manuscript may automatically be rejected. Whereas plagiarism, if it is identified and it is minor, then either the paper may be subject to an erratum or partial retraction, and the plagiarized portion may have to be corrected before it is published again, or if it is judged to be major, then it may be rejected or retracted if it has already been published. And author's institution may also be informed by the journal regarding plagiarism. So plagiarism is a serious offense. Never ever plagiarize. We shall see how you can avoid falling for plagiarism in the next few slides. So plagiarism of graphics, it's sometimes very difficult to identify whether a graphics is original or not. For example, you have a nuclear factor kappa B pathway specialty. So somebody may have written an article on that and made a figure on that. How do you, as a reviewer or an editor, how do you assess that it is original or not? So what you can do is you can go to Google Images and put this thing, and you can see whatever are the various already available images online in relation to this pathway. And sometimes it helps you identify actually plagiarized graphics or images. But otherwise, software won't be able to pick it up. So here, if I go to Google Images, it tells me all these published images related to the SGPGIMS pathway, and I can check through the top 20 or top 30 to see if they have copied something from elsewhere. So plagiarism of ideas is a more abstract concept, and generally editors won't be aware of it unless there is a specific complaint related to this. The burden of proof lies with the person who is making the complaint, and it's often difficult to prove. So plagiarism of ideas is difficult sometimes to, most of the times, to identify, and even once you identify it, you may have difficulty proving it, unless somebody has published a hypothesis before and somebody else publishes a paper based on that hypothesis without proving it. So another important thing is to cite your prior conference abstract. All of you will be doing your research work for your training, and you will be publishing those papers, and you will be presenting those at conferences. Obviously, first presenting them at conferences before publish. So when you are sending the publication out, please have a heading prior conference presentation and cite the abstract as it was presented in the conference. And also give a link to the online page where it is available. Why? Why should we do this? If you do not do this, what will happen? It will be flagged up as similar. So to avoid it being labeled as plagiarism, it will be flagged up as similar. That is inevitable. But to avoid it being labeled as plagiarism, you mentioned that this was presented at so and so conference as an abstract, so that now the editor can see that okay, this is not to be considered under plagiarism. This is simply a prior conference presentation. So otherwise, some editor who doesn't understand the meaning of plagiarism may simply think that this is plagiarism and reject it. So to avoid that, you need to do this. What happens if plagiarism is detected? You should not be scared of plagiarism. You could be asked to rewrite your thesis could be rejected, your papers would be rejected, and if your thesis or paper has been published, then retraction of either part or whole of the paper may happen. Obviously, it's a public shame, and institutes may expel such people who indulge in plagiarism. Journals may bar people who indulge in plagiarism either for a period of time or say that never submit to our group of journals again. So these could be the consequences. And in the Indian context, right from the time we are in school, we have been taught that you just reproduce, mug up what is there in the text and put that in your answer. And if you can do that 100%, you can 100% mark. Science doesn't work. You have to understand. So that was for school, that was for college, that was well. But now, when you are doing science, you have to write things in your own. So you must, that is the reason, because of this cultural thing, we are more susceptible to fall foul of plagiarism. But this is not acceptable in scientific publishing. And please make this a habit not to do that. And any verbatim reproduction should be within double quotes while duly acknowledging the source. So, an analysis of retractions from India available on PubMed from 2010 to 2017, nearly 60% of them were what could be called as plagiarism. And this was another analysis of retractions in our specialty. Again, a large number of them were due to duplication of text, data, content, plagiarism, or copyright. So these are the reasons why papers are retracted. Please take care that you don't fall foul of this kind of offense inadvertently. And now the University Grants Commission has published regulations which higher educational institutions are bound by to investigate for plagiarism. They suggest that all theses should be checked for plagiarism. And based on the level of similarity, actually they have recommended penalty. Similarity up to 10% is acceptable, 10 to 40, 40 to 60, and greater than 60% have different levels of punishment. Again, ideally, this should be a judgment based on what portion is judged to be plagiarized, but they have recommended the punishments based on similarity. And particularly, similarity in areas other than the methods are looked at very seriously, and the students may be their thesis submission may be delayed, or they may be the registration for the program may be cancelled, and similar penalties are also available for faculty to do this. What is important is to understand that higher educational institutions have a responsibility to create a mechanism to ensure that each paper published or thesis or dissertation submitted is checked for plagiarism. And also, it is a responsibility of the institution to make the students and faculty aware what is plagiarism and how to avoid it going forward. This is an example of a real life authenticate output, wherein this colored text here shows the similar text in this paragraph. So as you can see in this small paragraph of maybe 100 words, nearly 40 words are quite similar to the previously published literature. And you can see the software, even if you change a word in between, it picks it up as similar. So you may think that by changing a word here and there, you will get past the software, but it is smart enough to pick up. And here you see of this maybe 200 words, about 40 to 50 words are similar. And this sequence of words, this has obviously been copied from elsewhere. Had this occurred in isolation in the entire manuscript, there were 2 or 3 such sequences, then it is possible that it could have happened by accident. But this sequence, this sequence, this sequence, this in the same paragraph, it's very unlikely that it is an accident. So if the editor picks this up, they would reject it. So now coming to how we can avoid falling foul of plagiarism. Making a habit to reference everything. You are asked something in the word rounds, you are giving an answer, be ready with the source. So that it becomes a habit. When you are writing your manuscript, it doesn't need to be forced upon you that you need to reference it. Referencing becomes a habit. If you have access to a plagiarism checking software, do use it. Also learn to use available free softwares. Still, you don't have access to any software. What else can you do? After you have written the manuscript, take each sentence or couple of sentences, put it on Google and see, is it flagging up a similar to? Because what happens is, let's say you are writing a manuscript, in the discussion section you have read 20 different manuscripts. Since the age of 5 years, you have been taught that reproduce verbatim. Now, after this session, you know you don't have to reproduce content. This is never reproduce. But still, your mind inadvertently does that. And your inadvertently plagiarizing a sentence or two, or maybe a paragraph. Avoid that. If you check each and everything that you have written in Google and search for duplicate text, you will be able to identify such inadvertent instances of plagiarism, and then you can change that section. If you are reproducing figures and tables from elsewhere, first thing I would recommend that unless it is your own figure or table, do not reproduce. If it is your own figure or table that you reproduced previous publication, find out where the copyright rests, take the permission of the copyright holder. Carefully read each line of a manuscript, if necessary, going back to the reference paper to see if there is any similarity that has inadvertently left. And particularly so if you have written a manuscript similar to this, go back and read the same after they have written this manuscript to identify are there any phrases or paragraphs that are similar to what I have written before, so that we are not inadvertently clear. For editors and reviewers, it's very important to understand that plagiarism and similarity are different. So the similarity checking software is simply a screening tool. It cannot substitute for the human hardware that is required on the part of the editors and reviewers. And authors may have intermittently changed words, as we saw in that example that I showed. Review articles, sometimes somebody may take the content from a review article and publish it without in another review article without referring to the original review. But how can you identify that if the order of references, let's say reference number 65 to 70? In this new article, the reference numbers are 21 to 26, the same exact 6 references. Then it is likely that it was plagiarized, particularly if they have not referenced this original review. Images, we have seen that you can use Google Images. Similarly, tables in review articles, you can check similar review articles on that topic. Many journals now ask you to submit a disclaimer that no portion has been intentionally copied from this, and declare prior conference presentations so that it's not unnecessarily flagged by similarity checking software and inadvertently put forth as plagiarism. Manuscripts may have sudden changes in the tone. For example, the entire manuscript creation one way and in between 3 paragraphs reading another entirely different way. They may have been copied from elsewhere. So that's another trick that editors and reviewers use to identify plagiarism in manuscripts. So it is a good practice to write and rewrite the same thing yourself, and avoid reproducing figures and tables even with permission from previously published work unless absolutely necessary. And for one's own work also, it's better to adapt the figures or tables, that is, change them rather than simply reproducing them from one manuscript to the other. And try to make it as different from the original one, even if it's your own prior figure or table. So to conclude, it's important to educate younger colleagues about the menace of plagiarism, and it is equally a responsibility of universities and higher education institutions to establish mechanisms to educate regarding plagiarism and provide students and faculties free access to such software so that they can check their thesis or manuscript prior to submission. Questions about